Okay, so we often talk about gender as this really deep internal feeling, right? It's personal. But what happens when that completely private feeling needs to be expressed using public words? That's the fascinating philosophical puzzle we're going to dive into today, and it gets right to the heart of so many modern conversations about identity. So, the starting point for a lot of contemporary gender theory is this very idea that gender identity is defined by a wholly subjective determination. Or, to put another way, your gender is something that you, and really only you, can truly know and define. It's all about that internal, personal sense of who you are. And this idea is often called core gender identity. You can think of it as a kind of fundamental knowledge you have about yourself, a core belief about who you are. And in this view, the absolute authority on that knowledge is you.
But here's where we hit a really interesting philosophical snag. If a word like woman refers to a completely private feeling, an internal experience that nobody else can access, how can it possibly work as a public word? How can we all agree on what it means if we can't compare notes? To really get our heads around this problem, we've got to turn to one of the most famous thought experiments in all of philosophy. And let me tell you, it throws a real wrench into the idea that we can have a purely private definition for anything. So this brings us to the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein and his famous private language argument. His central idea was actually pretty simple, but it was also incredibly profound. He said that for language to mean anything at all, it has to be public. We need shared rules, public criteria for our words. He basically argued that a language based only on private, inner experiences would just logically fall apart. And he illustrates this with this brilliant analogy called the beetle in a box. Let's just walk through it real quick. Imagine everyone in a community has a box, and inside that box is something they call a beetle. But, and this is the absolute key, no one can ever look inside anyone else's box. Your entire understanding of what a beetle is comes only from your own private specimen. So here's the punchline, and it is brilliant. If we can never compare our beetles, what does the word beetle even mean when we talk to each other? Well, Wittgenstein's answer is that the actual thing in the box becomes totally irrelevant. It just cancels out. My box could have a scarab, your box could have a ladybug, someone else's box could be completely empty. The word beetle just ends up meaning whatever's in my box, and it loses all of its shared public meaning. And this is exactly where the analogy hits home for the gender debate. Critics of a purely subjective definition argue that if the word woman refers only to a private inner feeling, our own personal beetle in the box, then we run into the exact same problem. The public word woman risks becoming, vacuous. It risks losing its shared meaning. This whole philosophical challenge really helps us understand a common deadlock we see in a lot of gender debates, where different sides can sometimes fall into a very similar kind of trap. Let's take a look at what that is. What is so fascinating here is how two seemingly opposite views can end up making a similar philosophical move. On one side, you've got biological essentialism, the idea that woman is defined only by biology, chromosomes, anatomy, that sort of thing. On the other side, you have experiential essentialism, the idea that woman is defined only by having a certain set of shared life experiences. Now, both of these are criticized for basically the same reason. They try to boil down a really complex idea to a single essential feature, which almost always ends up excluding people. Okay, so if searching for one single defining essence, whether it's biology or experience or even a private feeling, just leads to a dead end, Wittgenstein's philosophy actually gives us some other tools to think with. The first tool he gives us is this idea of family resemblances. He asks us to just imagine for a second that members of a category don't actually need one single thing in common. Instead, maybe they're just linked by a whole web of overlapping similarities, kind of like how members of a family might resemble each other in all these different ways, but there's no single nose or eye color that everyone shares. His go-to example was the word game. Just think about it for a second. What is the one single feature that all games share? I mean, from board games to card games to ball games, there isn't one. Instead, as Wittgenstein put it, they share a complicated network of similarities. And this raises a really powerful question. Maybe the category woman works less like a box with one thing inside and more like the category game. And this brings us to his idea of language games. For Wittgenstein, meaning isn't some static label we just stick onto an object. Instead, a word's meaning actually comes from how it's used in the flow of our shared activities, our forms of life, as he called them. Meaning is something we do together, not something we just find. And these language games, they all rely on what some philosophers call hinges. These are the bedrock assumptions that our community just takes for granted. They're the things we don't even think to question. They're the solid ground we're all standing on. But, and this is the crucial part, that ground can shift. Hinges can and do move. This quote just illustrates the point perfectly. For Wittgenstein's generation, nobody has ever been on the moon was a hinge. It was an unspoken certainty. For us, that hinge has totally swung. It's now a historical fact that people have been there. This shows that these fundamental assumptions can radically change. And you could argue that what we're seeing today is a massive public renegotiation of the hinges that hold up our whole concept of woman. So this whole philosophical toolkit brings us to a really powerful way of reframing what it means when someone declares their identity. It's a shift away from this idea of knowledge and towards something else entirely. So how does this help us? Well, some philosophers suggest what they call a neo-expressivist view. And it argues that when someone says, "I am a woman," we shouldn't hear that as some kind of scientific report on a private inner object. Instead, we should hear it as an expression or an avowal. Think of it this way. It's like shouting ouch when you're in pain. You're not describing your pain for other people to inspect and verify. You are directly expressing it. This quote right here gets to the absolute heart of the matter. The focus shifts from private knowledge, this idea that I've looked inside myself and discovered a fact, to public acknowledgement. The question stops being about proving what you know, and it becomes about how we, as a community, acknowledge who you are. And this gives us a whole new way to think about what first-person authority really means. Your authority over your own identity isn't like a scientist who has special access to hidden data. No, it's an ethical authority. When someone expresses who they are, respecting that expression becomes a fundamental part of how we treat each other with dignity and recognition. So in the end, we don't land on some neat and tidy answer. Instead, we're left with a much more profound question. This whole philosophical journey shows us that the debate over gender isn't just a simple battle between private feelings and public definitions. It's really about the messy, ongoing, and deeply human process of how we, together, negotiate our shared language so that our most personal identities can have meaning, not just for ourselves, but for all of us.